Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Yeah, always exciting to be back.
So today we're going to be looking at this really fascinating book.
Oh,
Um,
oh yeah.
it's kind of a deep dive into how our brains work, but through like a neurophysics lens.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's not like your typical psychology book.
Ah,
And one of the things that really jumped out at me right away was this idea that our brains are like informivores.
hmm.
Like they're hungry for patterns, the same way we're hungry for food.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. The book really emphasizes that, how our brains are always trying to find order in the chaos, right? Like it
Yeah.
ties back to the concept of entropy. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh yeah, like the idea that the universe tends towards disorder.
Exactly. So our brains are constantly working against that,
Right.
sifting through all this stimuli to find these meaningful patterns.
So it's like our brains are constantly battling entropy just to like make sense of the world around us.
Precisely. It's what the book calls the pattern-entropy dynamic. Yeah, and it's the foundation of how we learn and, how we remember things and just how we make sense of everything. It's like our brains are constantly creating this user-friendly manual
Oh, a user-friendly manual. I love
for
that.
navigating reality.
Okay, so how does this pattern seeking actually like play out in our brains?
Well, the book uses this great analogy. Imagine throwing rocks into a still pond.
Okay.
So each rock creates these ripples, right?
Right.
Disrupts that smooth surface.
Yeah.
Now imagine if the water could instantly freeze as soon as the rocks hit.
Uh,
Those ripples would be preserved, right? Creating this lasting pattern in the ice.
so like those frozen ripples are kind of like a memory of the event?
That's a great way to put it, exactly.
Okay.
And that's kind of similar to how our brains form memories.
Okay.
When we experience something new, it's like those rocks hitting the pond, it
Yeah.
leaves an imprint.
Uh-huh.
But instead of ripples, our brains create new connections between neurons.
So it physically changes the structure of our brain.
Precisely like sculpting itself based on our experiences.
Wow, that analogy really like makes it clear how powerful and lasting like the impact of experiences can be on our brains.
Yeah.
It's making me think about how those patterns, like those frozen ripples, might influence how we react to things in the present.
That's a great connection to make, and it leads perfectly into another key concept from the book, internal representation.
Internal representation.
Okay.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So think of it this way. Our brains don't actually experience the world directly.
Mhm.
Instead, they create this kind of internal model, a simulation, if you will,
Like a virtual reality experience.
based on what our senses tell us, what we see, hear, feel, taste, and smell.
So kind of like a personalized virtual reality experience happening inside our heads.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting because we all prioritize different senses, right?
Oh.
Two people can witness the same event,
Mm.
but walk away with completely different interpretations of what happened.
That makes so much sense. Like we're each creating our own unique version of reality based on which sensory input is the strongest for us.
The book actually uses the term four tuples
For tubal.
to describe this. It refers to the four main sensory systems: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, which is touch and feeling, and then olfactory, gustatory, smell and taste.
Oh, wow.
Each experience becomes this unique combination of these four inputs,
Okay.
shaping our individual internal representation.
So depending on which sensory input is like most dominant for each of us, we're creating these slightly different four tuples
Mm-hmm.
and therefore different internal models of the same event.
Right.
That explains so much about why people react so differently to the same things.
It certainly does, and the book illustrates this beautifully with this story about a wife whose friend confides in her about her husband's infidelity.
Oh yeah, I think I remember reading this one. And then later that day, the wife's own husband comes home late and she just has this really like intense negative reaction.
Exactly, because her internal representation of husband being late is now intertwined with this idea of infidelity, even though her own husband might have a perfectly valid reason for being late.
Yeah, it's such a clear example of how our past experiences and the internal representations we create can really shape our reactions in the present.
And that's just scratching the surface.
Mhm.
The book also delves into how language can influence our internal representations and even change our behavior, which is where the concept of general semantics comes in.
Okay, I'm ready to hear more about that, but
Yeah.
I think we need to save it for the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
This conversation is already making me rethink how I process information.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we've covered a lot of ground already, but this next part is really fascinating. You mentioned the book dives into how language can shape our perceptions, and that's where general semantics comes in.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
developed by a guy named Korzybski, and it basically highlights how the structure of language itself influences how we understand reality.
Right. I'm all ears. How does language have that much power?
Well, think about it. Words are just symbols, representations of actual things and experiences. And as we discussed with internal representations, everyone has their own unique way of interpreting those symbols.
So there's always this gap between the word and the thing itself. And that gap can lead to misunderstandings.
Precisely, that gap can create distortions in how we see the world. The book uses a really interesting example to illustrate the term learning disabilities.
Right. And how that term completely changed the conversation around education.
Think about it. Before that term existed, if a child was struggling in school, the focus was often on the teacher's ability to teach. But introducing learning disabilities created this new way of looking at things. Suddenly, there was this idea that the responsibility wasn't solely on the teacher, but also on the student's ability to learn.
And that shift in language had a huge impact on everything from funding for special education to parental expectations. It's amazing how a single phrase can reshape an entire system.
It really highlights the power of language to shape our perceptions and even our societal structures. And speaking of powerful phrases, the book also dives into this fascinating world of memes.
Wait, memes like those funny cat pictures on the internet.
Not exactly, though. Those are definitely a type of meme, but in this context, memes refer to any idea, behavior, or style that spreads from person to person. Think of them like units of cultural transmission.
So like how certain catchphrases suddenly become super popular or fashion trends that seem to take over overnight, those are memes?
Exactly, and what's fascinating is that memes that are easy to reproduce have a huge advantage in spreading.
It makes sense. The simpler the idea, the easier it is to share and for it to catch on. The book uses that example of the Honda logo, right? It's so simple and memorable compared to something more complex like the Toyota logo, and that might be part of why Honda has been so successful.
That's a great example. It shows how these underlying principles of information processing and transmission can influence even something as seemingly unrelated as car sales.
Okay, my mind is officially bending a bit here. So we've got these brains that are constantly looking for patterns, creating internal representations based on our senses, and then language and memes are weaving their way into all of it, shaping our understanding of the world. It's like a giant interconnected web of information.
It really is. And speaking of interconnectedness, the book takes a really interesting turn by looking at the physical structure of the brain itself and how it relates to patterns found throughout nature.
Now, this is where it gets really wild.
Yeah.
Right. The book talks about how our brains are actually connected to the formation of stars and the concept of fractals.
It explains how the very elements that make up our brains were forged in the hearts of stars billions of years ago, and then it explores how these elements came together to form planets and ultimately life as we know it.
I've never thought about it like that before.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. We are literally made of stardust. But what about the fractals part?
Yeah.
How do those fit in?
Well, fractals are these repeating patterns that you find everywhere in nature, from the branching of a tree to the shape of coastlines. And it turns out our brains and bodies are also built using these same fractal patterns. Think about the branching of your blood vessels or the structure of your lungs.
So you're saying these patterns aren't just beautiful to look at, they're actually incredibly efficient for how our bodies function.
Exactly. They're optimized for information processing and energy use. It's like nature found a design that works really well and just kept repeating it on different scales.
That's fascinating. It makes me wonder if these patterns are also somehow connected to how our brains process information. Like maybe that's why we're so drawn to fractal patterns in art and nature, because they resonate with how our brains are structured.
That's a really interesting thought, and it leads perfectly into another area the book explores: human performance modeling.
Now, this is a concept I can get behind. Tell me more about this human performance modeling.
Well, it's basically looking at how we can learn from experts and potentially even transfer skills more effectively. Imagine if you could download the expertise of a master chef or a professional athlete directly into your brain.
Okay, that sounds a little like science fiction,
Yeah.
but I'm intrigued. What are the challenges involved in actually transferring skills like that?
One of the biggest challenges is that once a skill becomes unconscious, almost automatic, it
Wow.
becomes really difficult to articulate or transfer. It's like Try explaining how to ride a bike to someone who's never done it before. It's nearly impossible to put into words.
Right, because so much of it is muscle memory and intuition. You can't just download those things.
Exactly, and that's why traditional language-based teaching methods often fall short when it comes to transferring complex skills.
So what's the alternative? How do we overcome those limitations?
That's the big question, and it's something researchers are still actively exploring. The book hints at the need for new methods of modeling and downloading expertise, maybe going beyond language-based approaches.
So are we talking about some kind of brain-to-brain interface that's definitely venturing into sci-fi territory?
It might sound far-fetched, but who knows what the future holds. The possibilities are really mind-blowing when you consider the potential of understanding and harnessing the brain's capabilities.
We've talked about language memes and now human performance modeling. It feels like we've just scratched the surface of what this book has to offer. There's so much to unpack here.
There really is, but before we move on, I think it's important to circle back to this core idea of the book, the brain as a pattern-seeking machine.
Right, because that concept underpins everything else we've discussed.
Exactly. It's the foundation for understanding how we interact with the world, how we make sense of things, and how we form our beliefs. But I think the most important takeaway is that understanding our brain's pattern-seeking nature can give us a deeper appreciation for how we experience the world.
You know, when we were talking about memes earlier, you mentioned how easily reproducible ones have an advantage in spreading.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. Think about how quickly a simple slogan or jingle can catch on compared to a complex explanation, you know?
Right.
Our brains just crave easily digestible information.
Yeah.
So these simple, catchy memes, they spread faster, they spread wider.
It's almost like survival of the fittest for ideas.
That's a great way to put it, and it ties back to the structure of language itself.
Okay.
You know, some concepts, especially those that evoke strong emotions or tap into our shared experiences, they're just inherently easier to grasp and transmit.
It makes me think about how certain stories or symbols have persisted throughout history, like ancient myths or religious icons. They seem to resonate across cultures and time periods.
Right.
Perhaps because they tap into these universal patterns of human thought.
Exactly. Those enduring stories and symbols often carry simple, powerful messages that are easily reproduced and transmitted across generations.
Wow.
It's like they've cracked the code of cultural longevity.
That's incredible. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
I know, right?
From brains as pattern-seeking machines to the power of internal representations, the influence of language and memes, the physical structure of the brain, even the deep history of information in the universe.
It's a lot to take in.
It's mind-boggling to think about how all these pieces fit together.
It really is. It's been quite a journey.
But I think the most important takeaway is this understanding how our brains work, both on a physical and informational level, can be incredibly empowering.
Absolutely. It gives us the tools to make more conscious choices.
Right.
To break free from limiting patterns and to become more discerning consumers of information.
It's like we can start to see the world and ourselves in a whole new light.
Exactly. And ultimately, this knowledge helps us to better understand our place in this vast, complex, interconnected world.
So well said. Before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question.
Okay.
If our brains are so driven by patterns, what does that mean for our ability to break free from ingrained habits or beliefs? Can we actually rewire our brains to think and behave differently, even if those changes go against our ingrained patterns?
That's an excellent question, and it's something worth pondering, you know?
Yeah.
It challenges us to explore the limits and potential of our own brains and to consider the possibility of conscious transformation.
That's powerful.
Perhaps by understanding the underlying patterns that drive our thoughts and behaviors, we can gain a greater degree of freedom and create more fulfilling lives.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah,
Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive.
of course.
We hope you've enjoyed the journey.